Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon to our viewers. It is good to have you all here with us with the National Council of Churches. I am Minister Christian S. Watkins, the Justice Advocacy and Outreach Manager for the National Council of Churches, welcoming you to our first Faith and Fire Conversations 2.0 series, panel discussion on a Juneteenth call for reparations. On behalf of Jim Winkler, blessings to you. And on behalf of the staff, welcome to this conversation. I want to pass it along to my colleague and our Deputy Secretary, a good righteous woman named Andrea Alexander, Reverend Andrea Alexander, who will introduce herself as well as our panelists.
Good afternoon. We're so happy that all of you have decided to join us today as we are in the kickoff for a gazillion Juneteenth events in these coming days. And I say remembering, not so much celebrating. I know we think about it as a celebration, but in many ways, the whole idea of Juneteenth is a little flawed in that we are commemorating the fact that the state lied to enslaved persons for 2.5 years regarding the fact that they were supposed to have been emancipated. It's also even questionable as to whether or not Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed anybody, given the fact that it was only for those states that they considered to be in rebellion and did not include states that had not yet succeeded from the Union and so forth. So we have a very flawed country, yet we are trying to move towards justice, inequality, and liberation for all. So welcome and thank you. Today we have a really amazing group of people who will be speaking with us. I am actually going to open with a question and introduce them by name, but as they talk a little bit about their role and engagement on this issue, give a little more background about how they are working on it and what their understandings are. So we have the Reverend Mark Thompson, Miss Victoria Strang, Minister Christian Brooks, and Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs. And I'd like to just open this up. Again, we have this is an amazing piece of information regarding what does it mean to repair, what is reparatory justice, and why particularly we would be interested in discussing this in light of moving into the Juneteenth remembrance throughout the country. So I'm going to ask Reverend Mark Thompson if he would start. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone, to our brother Christian Watkins, to you, Reverend Alexander, all of the panelists. Very honored to be here with this esteemed group, which represents the diversity of our reparations movement now and our reparatory justice movement. As we are celebrating Juneteenth, I think all would agree that the hour is nigh to add even more legs and feet to our prayers for justice. And I think we've done that with the work of all of the organizations that are here and those even who are not here. For the first time, we are approaching 200 co-sponsors of the HR 40 reparations bill. And for those who don't know, the bill would establish a commission to determine what forms reparations, forms plural, by the way, reparations might take. This commission would hold hearings all over the country, talking with Americans about what reparations could and should be. And to have that many co-sponsors with a Democratic majority in the House is not only historic, but it speaks to how much the issue has evolved. At one point, reparations was like the word defund, and people thought of it as controversial or even fringe or just too radical, too Black nationalist, even too Pan-Africanist. But now I think we have begun to win the argument that it is the only real and ultimate solution to the woes that this country faces, woes that are rooted in the period of enslavement, the very system upon which this country was founded, and the very system which some of the undergirding and infrastructure of this country still depends on. So when we talk about Juneteenth, the very ancestors who found out about Juneteenth and found out about emancipation after it had already happened, I think they would be happy. In fact, I'm certain those ancestors are shouting and dancing with joy in heaven that all of us, their descendants, have moved this issue forward and are moving it to a place where it is undeniable, where in fact, for lack of a better word, it has become even mainstream. And so this will be a Juneteenth celebration this weekend quite like no other.
Thank you. Reverend Jim Bear, would you like to respond next, please? Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs. I am the co-director of racial justice for the Minnesota Council of Churches. I am a member of the Turtle Clan. I'm a citizen of the Stockbridge-Muncie Mohican Nation. And, you know, at the Minnesota Council of Churches, we have endeavored to take on really a bold new program and build it from the ground up. This program we are calling our Truth, Education, and Reparations program. And this would be a program that would be targeted at all of our member denominations across the state of Minnesota, 27 different denominations across the state of Minnesota. And this would be a program that asks our member denominations to sit in truth-telling events, to then engage in a deeper dive into the educating themselves around the issues of how white supremacy was built, how white supremacy built, yes, in general, the United States of America, but more specifically the state of Minnesota, how white supremacy was utilized as a tool in building that, and how many of our churches, particularly our historic and more historically white denominations, were complicit in that system of white supremacy that built the state of Minnesota. And then from there, we would call upon our congregations to be about the act of repair, to actively engage in reparations. And I so appreciate how Reverend Thompson mentioned how HR 40 would look at the forms of reparations using the multiple language in that, because the truth is there is not a single form of reparations that will satisfy the needs of communities. Now, our program at the Minnesota Council of Churches is unique in that we are actually looking at two impact communities that would be the focus of and recipients of those acts of reparations, that being the American Indian community and the historically Black community in Minnesota. And we are looking at these two impact communities because when we look at the history of this nation and we look at the cry for justice that has taken place, particularly from marginalized racial communities, we have, as a nation, we have not done a good job telling a complete story. And so what I mean for this, and I'll just use my context of Minneapolis. Minneapolis is it's the genesis of the American Indian movement in the late 60s and early 70s. It was a hot spot of the Black civil rights movement in the mid 60s, at least in the North. You know, there has been mantras that have been spoken out of these two justice communities. From the American Indian community, that mantra being that this nation was built on stolen land. And then from the African American community, that mantra being that this nation was built on stolen labor. And both of these stories are true, but they don't make up in and of themselves a complete story. And really the complete story of the founding and the building of this nation is that this nation was built upon the genocide of Indigenous people and the stolen land of Indigenous people. And this nation was built on the backs of enslaved African slaves. And that is the complete story of how this nation was built. And if we can come together and really focus our narratives moving forward as telling that complete narrative of how American Indians and African Americans have been the targets of racialized oppression longer than any other people group in this nation. And that is a narrative from the beginning. Then I think we can really move our conversation forward in utilizing our voices in justice for all. And I really, you know, we're a few days away from Juneteenth here in Minneapolis. I am looking forward to this Juneteenth, and I will put that in contrast to how I was feeling about Juneteenth 1 year ago at this time, when my city was in the midst of just incredible trauma at the hands of police. Of course, Juneteenth being literally weeks after George Floyd was killed a year ago. In my city, last year, Juneteenth was, yes, there were moments of observance and celebration, but really last year, Juneteenth was a moment of outrage. It was a moment of fear as we were literally watching our city burn. And I contrast that to what is happening and the plans that are in place for Juneteenth this year.
Thank you. We'll have a chance to expound a little more. Minister Christian Brooks, if you could introduce yourself and address these issues. And also, if you could give us an idea of kind of what you understand and know regarding collaborations that are taking place, followed by Victoria Strang, who could also give us some legislative updates regarding HR 40.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Christian Brooks. I am the representative for domestic issues for the Presbyterian Church USA Office of Public Witness. The Office of Public Witness is the public policy and advocacy office for the entire Presbyterian Church USA denomination. And at the Presbyterian Church USA, our work around reparations really started quite some time ago. In 2001, at our General Assembly, we passed the task force report on reparations. So we had a task force that studied reparations for both for Black Americans, for Indigenous peoples, and American Indians, and a few other groups. And we passed a report that affirmed the Presbyterian Church's stance on reparations, and also advised my office, the Office of Public Witness, to advocate specifically for HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans, and specifically as it pertains to African Americans. Our stance when it comes to reparations is really around dismantling systemic racism and ensuring racial equity. And I cannot say this enough, Black people cannot have racial equity without reparations. When it comes to what we have seen just this past year, 2020 on into 2021, the disproportionate issues that have affected the Black community have been a result of the remnants of enslavement and the following systemic racism. And as we are moving forward, we can't put policies in place without going back, looking at the history, fixing issues that happened in the past, and correcting policies. If we don't do that historical work, then the things that we are doing moving forward will not work. They will not work, and they won't help the Black community as much as they need to. Great example of that, the PPP loans during the CARES Act. So we all know that our system was built to keep financial support from Black Americans. Without addressing that and just putting resources there, Black people were not able to get those PPP loans that were set aside for minority-owned businesses. So we understand that as the Presbyterian Church, and our work when it comes to dismantling systemic racism and even fighting for reparations specifically for African Americans is a necessity to do the historical work, a necessity to look back, correct past wrongs, provide redress for past wrongs, correct policies, put practices and programs in place in order for Black folks to be able to have or achieve equal outcomes as their white counterparts. Now, when we are thinking about different initiatives that have been put in place, so there are quite a few educational institutions that have put initiatives in place that are just a start at reparations or reparatory justice. So Union Theological Seminary created a $1,000 endowment to support reparations. At the Presbyterian Church, we have our self-development of people. So the self-development of people came out of James Foreman's call for reparations from religious institutions and from denominations and the ecumenical or interreligious community. So the self-development of people mainly focuses on helping people of color. But then we also have what recently happened in Evanston. So there are quite a few initiatives going on currently for reparations, for reparatory justice, for redress. And now it's time for our government to get on board.
Victoria?
Thank you, Reverend Alexander, and thank you all for having me here with you today. My name is Victoria Strang. I am the policy advocate with Faith Communities at Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch is an international, nonpartisan nonprofit that works to investigate, expose, and change human rights abuses. My background is actually in faith-based community organizing, and I have an MDiv from Yale Divinity School. I have been working with faith communities for a long time now and on a variety of different issues, whether that's housing, immigration, workers' rights, healthcare, you name it. I have worked on campaigns around those. And a lot of that work really brought me to this space here today and to the work on reparations. As I worked on all of these issues, it became really clear to me that structural racism was really undergirding a lot of the inequities that were going on in our country. So when I took the position with Human Rights Watch, I was delighted to know that they had made HR 40 and reparations a priority. We have clear grounding for reparations within scripture that many people on this call can talk about. But from the human rights perspective, we also have very clear grounding in international human rights law around the need for remedy and reparation. So we know that victims of serious human rights violations, of which racism and systemic discrimination are clear examples, they have the right to effective remedy and reparations, and governments have an obligation to fulfill those rights. So that is the standpoint from which Human Rights Watch is coming. And as a person of faith, I am also coming to this with an understanding of where the gospel calls me to be led and to work to repair the world. So we have been doing a lot of work on pushing HR 40. Reverend Mark mentioned that we are almost at 200 co-sponsors for the bill, which is the greatest number of co-sponsors that we have had. So we're in a great place right now, and we are doing a lot of grassroots organizing and work within the faith community to really get us to a place where we can get this bill to be voted on the House floor. And I'm happy to talk about that a little more as we go on.
Thank you. Thank you all for those introductory remarks and letting us know where you're coming from individually, and having and working with you all, NCC, Andrea and I, and our organization working with you all, your respective organizations, in order to advocate for justice and move this legislation along. It is a privilege to work alongside of each one of you all. Reverend Mark and Victoria, if you would, can you give us a little, we've heard about the background of the legislation and whatnot. Can you give us a little bit of background of the history of what is taken, what's transpired to get the legislation here after 30 years, and the resistance that you all are seeing, having worked with in Cobra and NARC and you know, in Human Rights Watch, trying to push the needle. Talk to us a little bit about the history of the struggle and where we are now.
Victoria, you want to go first, or you want me to go first?
Well, you've been in this for a long time, so I feel like you should give that history. I can bring us up to date today if you want.
All right, thank you. So the legislative movement for reparations began in earnest in 1989. Now, obviously, there have been calls for reparations throughout history, beginning with the likes of Callie House and down through the years, and Queen Mother Moore. It was a very well-known individual in Detroit known as Reparations Ray, who began to push his member of Congress, John Conyers, to introduce HR 40, which John Conyers did in 1989 and has been reintroduced every year since then. After John Conyers left Congress, and Cobra and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who inherited sponsorship of the bill, sat down and did sort of an HR 40 upgrade, if you will, an HR 40 2.0. The original HR 40 called for there to be a commission to study slavery and whether there should be reparations. That was the original HR 40. The new upgraded HR 40 2.0, if you will, doesn't do that. It moves beyond. It stipulates enslavement happened, and it stipulates the vestiges of enslavement happened. That's all of slavery's evil offspring, from voter suppression to Jim Crow to lynchings to segregation, on and on and on, to what we see in modern day police lynchings, which I call the police demic. All of these things are vestiges. And what the current HR 40 upgrade says is that these things happened and are happening. Instead of studying whether there should be reparations, we can now graduate to studying what forms reparations might take. So if you think about all the co-sponsors and the possible passage in the House, Congress would essentially be voting for reparations to happen and to determine what forms they would take. The original bill would have been Congress voting to study whether we should even have reparations. But if this bill would have passed, it is even co-sponsored by the Speaker of the House, they are all saying that we support reparations. We're just going to appoint a commission to figure out what forms those reparations should take. In light of what happened during the last summer, the momentum for reparations has picked up because people are now beginning to see that we can't just throw lip service at this history. We can't just feel good. We can't just emote. We need concrete proposals to solve the problem of racism and white supremacy in this country, and enslavement and the vestiges of enslavement. And so through the hard work of all the organizations gathered here, the National Council of Churches, the Presbyterian Church, even our sisters and brothers in the indigenous community, I remind everyone, Columbus didn't discover America. And Big Gregory used to say, if he was sitting in his car and somebody came to steal his car, they couldn't say they discovered it, they stole it from him. The fact of the matter is, in the 1300s, freed African people before enslavement journeyed here to North and South America and established relationships with the indigenous people. It was in the 1400s that Columbus came, and he brought with him those who he would enslave, not only for the purpose of attacking and wiping out the native indigenous population, but enslaving those of us he kidnapped from Africa. And so that's what we're talking about. It is through that work, through all the different church denominations, through solidarity with our indigenous people and people of all cultures, Asian, Latino, from all over the world, who in many respects, the Jewish community, in many respects, they themselves have demanded reparations for injustices toward them. They are now even in solidarity with us. And as I throw it to Victoria, the presence of Human Rights Watch takes this issue to an international level. Marcus Garvey died appealing to the League of Nations for international redress of our grievance, the international community taking up the cause of the African American. Malcolm X met with Dr. King after he went to Selma briefly, and they agreed that once Dr. King got out of jail in Birmingham, they would together finish Marcus Garvey's work, finish what he started, and go to the United Nations and press for human rights, elevating our civil rights struggle to a human rights struggle with an international portfolio. And so Human Rights Watch, very presence, moving from civil rights to human rights, as far as I'm concerned, is the continuum, the historical continuum of the work that Marcus Garvey started, that Malcolm X and Dr. King discuss, and raising the level of international exposure and interest in our cause. Because in all of the other reparations movements, whether it be the Jewish people, whether it be the Asian people, or any other people, there is an international component and international support for those reparations movements. We need that for our movement here as Africans in America, and we've gone a long way to get to this point, and we're thankful for that. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Victoria, because she can talk about not only how we've gotten here, but what Human Rights Watch is doing in its very important role to make this happen.
Thanks, Reverend Mark. Yeah, I just want to note before I get into exactly what's going on now that there is a lot of precedent for commissions of this style that HR 40 would produce. There were widely known the 1946 Indian Claims Commission Act, which we believe did not go far enough, but did create a commission to investigate and determine the validity of claims from Indian tribal nations. We also had the 1978 President's Commission on the Holocaust and the 1980 Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, which the government actually issued a formal apology for the internment of Japanese Americans. They granted them redress in the form of financial compensation and educational benefits to survivors and their families. So HR 40 is a very straightforward bill. It would establish a federal commission to study the legacy of slavery and ongoing systemic racism in the country and provide recommendations for redress. And this is not something new to the government. It has happened before a number of times. And we are very fortunate, as Reverend Mark said, this bill has been pushed since the 1980s, but we're actually at a place right now due to the overwhelming response at police violence and racial segregation that is ongoing in the country, that more and more leaders, community members, and international governments are speaking out on the need to address reparations and racial injustice within the United States. So where we are currently in the legislative process is that we are working to get to that 200 co-sponsor level. As of this morning, we have 190 co-sponsors from the House. The bill made it out of the House Judiciary Committee. It was the first time it was voted out of the House Judiciary Committee ever, and that happened in April. And now we're trying to push it to a House floor vote. And our goal is to get that sometime next month because Congress is going on recess in August. So we're working right now to get a lot of grassroots support to get additional co-sponsors for the bill. Again, we just need that 10 more to push us over the edge. So in encouraging and activating communities across the country, a lot of faith leaders have come together and we've created this faith toolkit, which will help congregations, individuals, religious organizations, whomever wants to get involved in this conversation, take action and provide exact steps for how they can take action. And that can include writing or calling their member of Congress. It can include doing phone banking, anything to really push us to that 200. And a lot of that needs to come from the community. It needs to come from constituents. We have a number of groups, Human Rights Watch, ACLU, the legacy reparation groups that have worked on this for years, but we're really looking to encourage more grassroots support of this legislation. Because as everyone on this call has said, this is really the time. You know, I think going through the pandemic has just further highlighted the systemic inequities that continue to exist within our country. Then we had the impacts of January 6th, and we're seeing this rise of white nationalism and white supremacy and criticisms of critical race theory. You know, it's time for the federal government to study the legacy of slavery and the history of the descendants of enslaved persons within the United States and really take the time to make a formal apology, get this on congressional records, and help us to start repairing the damage that has been done.
Thank you very much. Christian Brooks, could you give us some ideas of experiences that you've had, in what ways are you working with a predominantly white denomination regarding this issue And how do you respond to pushbacks and those who don't think this is enough? Just talk a little bit about that. And Jim Bear, follow up with a similar question with you as a state council doing this with a very white state, a very white city. So Christian Brooks, and you can follow up. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that question. So, first of all, as Victoria said, there are a lot of action steps that folks can take in order to advocate for this bill. And I push that out to Presbyterians quite often. We have an action alert that we've sent out that we're going to send out again, advising folks to call their member of Congress, write to their member of Congress and ask them to co-sponsor this bill and to support this bill. But also, being in a predominantly white space, I have found that especially after the events of the summer of 2020, a lot of white groups have jumped on the racial equity bandwagon, so to speak. And I cannot stress enough that Black people cannot have racial equity without reparations. And when it comes to the thought of racial equity, we have to do a deep dive into the history of why groups are in the position that they are in the first place. So when it comes to reparations and the conversations that I am having with my Presbyterian folks, my Presbyterian people, I always say, you can't just look at what's going on now and then try to fix it for the future. Because if we don't look at the history and fix the history, the exact same issues are going to occur. And I would advise, I would pray for anyone else who is also doing work with predominantly white spaces and predominantly white groups, to have a deeper understanding of what racial equity actually is and how to bring it about. Right? We have to go backwards. We cannot just go forward. But within the Presbyterian Church, we have gotten some pushback when it comes to reparations, and some of the pushback that we have gotten has been because people don't understand what HR 40 actually is. Quite honestly, people think that if HR 40 passes, then somebody is getting a reparations check tomorrow. But that's not what it is. HR 40 seeks to study the effects of enslavement and systemic racism and to make proposals. And for anyone who is against reparations, this should be great. Because if reparations shouldn't happen, then let the research say it. But we know what the research is going to say. So we are hammering in that this is a study bill. This is a study bill. This is a study bill. And, there are some folks who will say when we send out our action alerts, well, reparations was what happened when Union soldiers died during the Civil War. And, quite honestly, we know that there were quite a few Black folks that fought on the side of the Union as well. But also, we know that thousands, millions of enslaved persons died so that folks could walk around with cotton clothes on. So with that being said, it is important to acknowledge the lives of the enslaved people who died, to acknowledge that those lives are just as valuable as the Union soldiers who died. And if enslavement did not happen, then those Union soldiers would not have died. So I could keep going on, but I will yield to you, Reverend Jim Bear.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, as Reverend Andrea mentioned, in Minnesota, yeah, largely white states, filled with well-intentioned white people. Minnesota, particularly in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area, we have a lot of very good white liberal people, and in some aspects, they are an ally. They are an asset to the work. Here in Minnesota, particularly in Minneapolis and St. Paul, George Floyd's murder on May 25th, 2020, catalyzed something in a lot of well-intentioned white folks, particularly well-intentioned white Christians. And it seems like all of a sudden, within the last year, that word reparations is not as fear-inducing anymore, particularly in some of the more progressive churches. This notion that, hey, if we read the gospel correctly, God's people are supposed to be about the work of reparations. That's kind of the whole meaning of the gospel. The problem, one of the obstacles that I am facing in this work is having deep discussions with white people about what reparations actually is, particularly white Christians, because all of these churches, they have a benevolence fund, they have their Samaritan fund, they have their arm for charitable acts within community. And so the response towards reparations for a lot of these churches has been, well, we will just up our budget for our Samaritan fund or our benevolence fund, or we'll increase our giving, or we'll take up, 3 or 4 extra special offerings throughout the year for these community organizations or individuals in need. And they think that's reparations. And the conversation we have to have is no, that's not reparations. That's good work. That's the Lord's work. God bless you in it. But that is not reparations. That is charity. And charity can only operate in systems where the imbalance is in place, where the hierarchy is in place. And reparations is a method in which we target those systems and we target that imbalance and we work towards bringing about equity in the systems. And so reparations needs to be focused on undoing those systems of hierarchy where that privilege imbalance is in place. And that's what, that's the difficult work, because, here we have a lot of Minnesotans here, multi-generational wealth here, good Christian people, who, when they hear reparations, they're like, okay, I'm going to feel the pain of this a little bit. And my response is, no, you need to feel the pain of this a lot. Because, when you look at the source of your generational wealth, you can't wash that stain off your hands. That generational wealth for, I would say, I'm just guessing here, but I would say for probably at least 90% of those who carry generational wealth, it is stained with the blood of indigenous people. It is stained with the blood of African people. And so when we talk about reparations, particularly for our churches, cannot simply be doing more charity better. It has to be a release of power and a systems change.
Thank you, Jim Bear and Christian for taking those questions. Yeah, you definitely went hard and left no stone unturned. Appreciate your candor. Um, for final comments, because it's nearing the 2 o'clock hour, and I know we all have meetings to get to. As people of faith, as people who are known by their love, hopefully, prayerfully, what is your theological or your faith foundation for supporting or for advocating for HR 40? Reverend Mark, if you want to take that first question, if you want to take it first before we leave.
So, what is? And I want to make sure I have the question correct. What is the theological argument or foundation? Is that what you're asking?
What's yours? When you meet someone who wants to get engaged with work, but they're not quite sure, they may think that our Christian narrative, our Christian story, does not have anything to do with reparations. How would you respond to that kind of resistance, and how would you encourage people of faith, congregations, to pursue reparations, or to also acknowledge and repair their own relationship with Black communities around them?
Well, unfortunately, we shouldn't be picking and choosing what verses of scripture to read or employ for our convenience. Just like when people would use the Bible to admonish the LGBTQIA community, the Bible also says that we should not handle the carcass of a swine. So then we shouldn't be watching the NFL on Sunday. And nobody's going to stop doing that, right? The Old Testament also speaks to reparations. It's very, very clear in Leviticus and other scriptures. Now, that was a different type of enslavement referred to in the Bible. We're talking about the chattel enslavement of our people, but nevertheless, reparations were made. Compensation was made to those who were enslaved. So there's that pretty much laid out. But you mentioned those of us who are Christians. So if we look to the New Testament, we find that Jesus gave his life for the sins of the whole world. Right now, we're talking about the sins of America. And what do we always say about Christ's passion and Christ's crucifixion? We said he was ransomed, that he was ransomed for the sins. Now, usually when we think about ransom in a modern context, that's money. That's something that is paid to get out of a certain situation. And we've always used that term ransom. I've heard it all my life. It's a term throughout, Christendom, ransom captive. The point is, I think that's an apt metaphor, that if Christ could certainly be ransomed for the sins of the whole world, then those of us today, the very least we can be, are those who are organizing for and mobilizing for and educating people for the sins of America. And for those who are Christians who still have some doubt about this, what would Jesus do? He did it. He did it. He could have come down off that cross. He could have done anything else. He could have been like, no, I don't think I'm going to go through with this. But he made the sacrifice, the greatest sacrifice of all for us. It is a small sacrifice for us to make in this struggle for reparatory justice, all of us who are Christians, and an even smaller sacrifice monetarily for the United States to make when there has been nothing but the benefit to America's riches that has been gained from our enslavement. Somebody say, well, that's a long time ago. That had nothing to do with me. All of this success that exists in America today, the riches, the success, the technology, exists because of the foundation laid there by the Africans who were kidnapped and brought here. Everything we contributed has been to America's benefit. And there are those who are around today who may not have decided to benefit from that. Inevitably, you do, because that's the way it's set up. And so it's time for us to have justice for that. It's time for us to make repair. It's time for all of us to be made whole. So that would be my theological argument in favor of reparations.
Thank you for that, Christian. Let's see. What's been your experience? Thank you, Reverend Mark. I appreciate that theological grounding. And if you have to leave right now, since you're a busy man, getting people together to pass this legislation, thank you so very much for your time here with us.
God bless you all. Thank you for having me. Appreciate all the hard work everyone is doing, especially those of you on the panel, those of you watching and listening. Please help to get involved and have your member of Congress encourage HR 40 to be brought to the floor this summer. HR 40 to the floor. God bless you all.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Reverend Mark. Christian Brooks, if you would, come speak to us about your experiences within the PCUSA and trying to bring communities together in regards to, just that those repertory actions of not just bringing themselves together, the different cultures, the different ethnicities, but also working towards that justice.
Okay. So when it comes to the biblical justification, so to speak, for reparations, or quite honestly, for advocacy in general, whenever I'm doing any teaching within the Presbyterian Church and for my own life, I always look to Luke 4 verses 18 through 19, Jesus's mission, right? Because to me, as Christians, we're called to continue Jesus's mission. And it reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So let's focus on the last two: to let the oppressed go free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So the year of the Lord's favor is a reference to the year of Jubilee. And the year of Jubilee is when the indentured servants were set free. It is when they were set free. It is when all debts were forgiven and all property was returned. Now, we know that enslavement in America was not indentured servitude. It was chattel enslavement, right? That means that folks were not paying back a debt. They were born into enslavement. They died as a enslaved person. Their children were supposed to be enslaved. So because they were not paying back a debt, let's focus on all property was returned. That means unpaid wages. In my eyes, that is property. Unpaid wages. Any advancement that you made as a result of my labor. So Reverend Mark talked about technological advancement. This country has made a lot of money based on technological advancements. That is property that needs to be returned. All of the progress that this country has made as a result of enslavement on the backs of Black people, that's property. That's accolades. That is representation. That is, I can't even think of the word right now, but it needs to be returned. But when we think about where it says to let the oppressed go free, in my head, that means that we have to dismantle a system that created oppression in the first place, right? We can't let the oppressed go free while we're also participating in a system of oppression, while the system of oppression is still here. So in order to let the oppressed go free, that means that I, as a Black woman, should be able to achieve the same outcomes as my white counterpart without having to jump over 55, 65, 75 different hoops in order to do it that they don't have to jump over. I should have an equal opportunity at success. I should have an equal opportunity to be able to live a successful, healthy, well life that my counterparts have. And I cannot do that without dismantling the system of oppression, right? And in order to dismantle the system of oppression, as I mentioned before, we have to go back. We have to go back in history. We have to provide redress for harms that happened. We have to provide payback for things that were taken. But we also have to provide resources that I was never given, that my white counterparts were given in the first place. I'll stop there.
And the church said, "Amen." Thank you, Christian, for that tutorial on what the year of the Lord's favor means, as well as like what we're called to do as people of faith, as Christians. In following and modeling Christ's activities on earth, and bringing about those things on to earth that are let loose in heaven. Jim Bear, if you would, as an Indigenous person, what are your thoughts on the theology, on the reasons why, on why it's imperative for us to make some progress in this way?
Sure. My prophetic call to the white churches to be engaged in racial justice work, particularly the work of reparations, comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is teaching, and he says, if you are bringing your gift to the altar, and before you bring your gift to the altar, you remember that your brother or sister has a grievance against you, leave your gift, don't present it to the Lord. First go and make right with your brother and sister, and only then come back and make your offering to the Lord. This is, if white churches read this with seriousness and sincerity, this should absolutely frighten us as people of God. Jesus is saying, don't even come before the divine presence. Don't even come into the house of the Lord until you've made right your relationship with those brothers and sisters who have a grievance against you. And to the church in America, to the white church in America, listen, your Black brothers and sisters have a grievance against you. They have a just grievance against you. Your Indigenous brothers and sisters, we have a grievance against you, and it is a just grievance. And so before you even come on a Sunday into God's presence, in order to be God's people, Jesus is saying you need to be about healing and repairing that which is broken. And it's that simple. If we're not about the work of reparations, repair, and healing, we have no right to call ourselves the people of God. That's what the words of Jesus.
Wow, bluntly put. Bless you for that admonishment. And Victoria, if you would wrap us up, let us know your reason for being in this space, and also our call to action. What are we supposed to do with all this information now?
Thanks, Christian. And, I want to point out that I am the only white person on this panel, and I feel like I need to be very open with the fact that I was raised in a predominantly white Protestant denomination and continue to be an active member. And I grew up with a lot of the theology put into practice that Jim Bear has mentioned, which is that charity model. And I'm encouraging people, given the theological reflections that we've heard from Reverend Mark, Christian, and Jim Bear, to really think about how God calls us to do more than charity and to look at a model of justice, and to think through why we focus on charity, why charity continues to be the easiest response, and why we might be hesitant to go further for the model of justice. And in this, I mean taking a stand, advocating, really reaching out to people of power to make your voice heard and to make your beliefs heard. And to me, I could cite, many of the biblical passages that have been said, as well as many more, because there is a lot of scriptural evidence for reparations and redress to past harms. But for me personally, I look at this wider understanding we get from Jesus and the gospel, which is to upend systems of oppression. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the panel, I have worked on a lot of different issues, from housing to immigration to healthcare, and many faith groups advocate for those issues. But if we look at the heart of why those injustices exist, why we have issues with housing, why we have people who are blocked from accessing Section 8 housing, why we have higher Black maternal mortality in this country than in many developing countries, a lot of that is because the system is marginalizing a huge subset of the population. And it is our call as Christians to advocate for policies that would help create the vision of the world that Christ intended. And so that's why I think it's so important for Christians, especially white Christians, to have these conversations on reparations, to understand what reparations means. If you are nervous because you think it means cutting a check for people, please do your research, because that's not what it means. And we have a number of things that you can read, resources that you can access. And we are all happy to walk with people through this journey. So my call today is for people to either reach out to me, reach out to the other panelists, look at that faith advocacy toolkit, and really get out and start calling legislators, start speaking to family and friends about this issue, writing op-eds, writing letters, whatever you can do to really get us to these 200 co-sponsors so that this bill has its chance to be heard on the House floor. And this bill has a chance to really make it through this legislative process so that our nation can start this process of discussing reparation and healing. And again, I will put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to connect with anyone who would be interested in this. And I really look forward to working with you all.
Well, on behalf of the National Council of Churches, Victoria, Christian, Jim Bear, Reverend Mark, thank you very much for your time and for your talent and for your putting your treasures on display for us in making the call, making the plea for reparations, for support of the House Resolution 40, the Commission to develop reparations proposals, as well as to study the legacy of slavery. As of now, for those who are still listening, for those who are watching us now, if you would go to the National Council of Churches website, that's nationalcouncilofchurches.us. Sign up for our updates to stay in tune for more of these conversations we will be having. Also, as you sign up for those updates, go to our Act Now tab, where you'll see all of our Act Now to End Racism resources. On that tab, you'll see the opportunity to check our anti-racism resources, where we have a lot of information listed on reparations on HR 40. From there, you'll see the information for the legacy organizations that have been working on HR 40 since it was an infant bill 30 years ago, led by or introduced by Representative John Conyers. You'll see information for the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, the NCOBRA organization, and you also will see information, or you'll see a link to the National African Americans Reparations Commission. Those two organizations, in addition to the Human Rights Watch, are instrumental in making sure that Representative Sheila Jackson Lee has the support and has the people power in order to make this legislation pass, in order to make this legislation successful. So please do go check out those resources. Sign up for the National Council of Churches updates, and also stay tuned for an upcoming conversation on voting rights in America. What's our faithful response to making sure that our democracy is safeguarded and improved for generations to come? My name is Christian Watkins, the Justice Advocacy and Outreach Manager for the National Council of Churches. Peace and blessings to you all, and go forth and make justice happen, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God who resides in each one of us. Peace out, y'all.
Thank you.